Hello Raptors fans, and welcome to Raptors Report. Today we're going to be looking at the events that transpired last week leading up to the trade deadline, what the Raptors did, my evaluation of the deal itself, and what might happen with the rest of the season. Let's jump in. So the Raptors finally traded Goran Dragic. Not exactly a surprise, but the Raptors managed to trade the veteran Slovenian point guard to the San Antonio Spurs for Thaddeus Young. Of the two options, the other being buying him out of his contract, this was certainly the more preferable choice. The Raptors traded a player who wasn't playing for a veteran forward that could bolster their moribund bench. This wasn't all upside, however. The Raptors had to give up some draft compensation to land Thaddeus. The Raptors traded their first-round pick this year along with Dragic to acquire Young as well as Detroit's 2022 second-round pick. Usually, a first-round pick for a second-round pick is a massive loss of value, but in this case, the Pistons are among the worst teams in the league, meaning that their second-round draft pick is almost like a late first, as they'll be probably picking in the early 30s. The Raptors have also played well enough that their pick is no longer a lottery pick, and if they continue their winning ways, it might end up in the 20 range. Draft picks, as many people are well aware, are one of the best ways for teams to cheaply improve and add young talent to their teams year over year. The draft pipeline is important to a team like the Raptors because they are still relatively young, all things considered, and have a long and successful history of building their team through the draft. With that said, this pick swap isn't like giving up a first rounder outright, it's more like dropping back in the draft around 10 to 15 spots. I've seen people say that this is even a positive because the Raptors won't have to commit as much salary to their eventual pick. That's taking it way too far in the other direction, because moving down potentially 15 spots can eliminate a ton of the prospects that you would want in a draft. The way that rookie contracts work in the NBA is so team-friendly that going from a first-round pick to a second-round pick in terms of the money spent is negligible, and certainly does not counterbalance the potential value lost due to picking 10 or more spots lower. There was a cost to the Thad Young deal, and it wasn't trivial. Now let's look at what the Raptors got back. Number 1, Thaddeus Young. And number 2, space under the tax threshold. So, Thaddeus Young is not so young. He's a 14-year NBA veteran who, in his prime, I would call a super role player. Super role players are guys that do a lot of the things that aren't associated with stardom, like scoring and ball handling, but at the same time are very important for winning basketball games. Defense, rebounding, passing, stretching the floor, etc., etc. When they're on the floor, they make things a lot easier for your team. Thad Young is kind of like that. Even at 33, he's a good rebounder, a good defender, a great passer for a forward, and a smart teammate who will make the right play on both ends of the floor. The Spurs under Greg Popovich did not emphasize three-point shooting, but I'm certain that the Raptors under Nick Nurse will be getting him to shoot corner threes, and he's been an okay three-point shooter in the past as well. In his past 5 years in the leagues, he took just under 2 threes a game and made about 35% of them. If he's able to shoot around that mark, he should be an okay guy to park in the corner when he's not involved in the pick and roll. Now, let's get to what I think about the deal. Prior to the trade, my list for what the Raptors should get was 1. A guard who could help run the offense when Fred VanVleet is off the floor, and number 2, a traditional center to help match up against the other big men in the league. This trade doesn't address either of those things. They added another forward who probably won't be around after this season, and spent some draft capital in order to do it. On the other hand, I did ask the front office to make a move to acquire a bench player that could help reduce the minutes load on the Raptors' top players, and this does that to a certain extent. After the trade deadline, Masai Ujiri did a press conference where he laid out his vision for the team, saying that the NBA was a copycat league and that they were trying something new that could potentially change the formula for how the rest of the league works. This trade is essentially doubling down on the front office's 6-9 vision. The Raptors appear to be comfortable with the big lineups that we've seen every time Fred VanVleet sits, and Thaddeus Young represents an interesting way of adding additional playmaking to that group. Hypothetically, if the Thad Young deal were proposed to me prior to the trade deadline, I probably would have poo-pooed it, saying that the Raptors weren't in need of another forward, that they shouldn't move back in the draft, that Thad Young was a one-year rental, etc. What I'm about to say might make me sound like a bit of a homer, but if the Raptors front office does something, I like it a little bit more than I would have if I were evaluating the trade in a vacuum. Doubting the Raptors front office has not been a winning formula for most pundits over the past decade, as Masai Ujiri has arguably been the best basketball executive in the world for that time period. Instead of trying to water down their approach, it looks like they're going to lean into it, and that's something that's pretty exciting. But at the same time, the front office is not without sin. They've made missteps with signings, trades, player evaluations, and other team-building decisions. A lot of those mistakes have been errors in the finer details rather than foundational flaws in team-building philosophy, however. So, I will grade this trade with a TBD. A bit of a cop-out, but there are big question marks. Can Thaddeus Young at 33 still deliver quality minutes enough to justify moving back in the draft? Did the Raptors fail to address bigger needs at other spots on the roster? Will the Raptors' big philosophy work in the playoffs? Will the Raptors be able to acquire a difference maker on the buyout market? That last question serves as an excellent segue into the final aspect of the Thad Young-Goran Dragic deal. The cost savings. After trading for Thaddeus Young and Drew Eubanks, who was waived soon afterwards, the Raptors actually shed $3.4 million worth of salary, meaning that they moved to about $4 million under the luxury tax threshold. This should allow the Raptors to be players in the buyout market. March 1st is the buyout deadline, and prior to that date, teams will begin to buy players out of their contracts to allow those players to join other competing teams. Bobby Webster indicated that the Raptors would be looking at potentially signing some of these buyout candidates in order to bolster the roster heading into the playoffs. Some of the bigger names that might be available on the buyout market are Robin Lopez, Gary Harris, Dennis Schroeder, Thomas Satoransky, and perhaps even John Wall. If the Raptors are able to come away with a good depth piece, that would significantly change the value proposition on the Thad Young trade, making it a two birds with one stone deal. MLSE was simply not going to pay the luxury tax, and the Raptors were pressed right up against it, meaning that they couldn't add anybody in free agency. So getting a few $1 million under the tax threshold mean that the Raptors could potentially add another difference maker off of the bench. And that about sums up my thoughts on the Raptors trade deadline. What are your thoughts on the Thaddeus Young deal? Do you believe in Masai's vision for the team? Were there other players you wish the Raptors went after? How about the buyout market? Do you have a player you'd love to see the Raptors sign? Let me know in the comments here on YouTube, or follow me on Twitter at RapsReport. I always love hearing from other Raptors fans. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel out. And as always, thanks for watching Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.